Now, I just want to say a few things, and then I'm going to introduce a fabulous panel, and quite a diverse one as well, because we have people doing research in science, as well as doing communication in the media, in informal mechanisms, in education. So we're going to have lots and lots to talk about. But I wanted to start just with talking a little bit about this notion of gender in science communication, because the lead question, and Liz, maybe you can help me with this, why journalists ask me this question all the time. The lead question I'm always asked when I talk to groups is, how do we get more women in science? Is that a question that you've heard quite often as well? How do you get more women in science? I think, well, that's interesting. I'm in science communication. And this key question of how to get more women in science, though, becomes really instructive, I think, for us in how we think about women in science communication. And here's my thinking about this. I'll be slightly provocative, and maybe people will disagree, and that could be fun, too. So when I'm asked, how do you get more people, how to get more women in science, I always say, well, that's interesting. Why do you think people don't go into science? And what I find is that frequently, folks who ask this question aren't terribly reflective about what the barriers and challenges to a career in science are. So I've experienced this from the other side. So on 3 continents, I have interviewed students that want to study science communication. Typically, about half of those people already have a PhD in science. And they come and they say, you know, I love science, but I don't want to be at the bench anymore. I said, okay, that's really interesting. They envision, at least in the first instance, science communication as a way of opting out of science. And they're worried that that's how it's going to be seen amongst their peers. So in 3 continents, over hundreds of interviews, I've probably not yet heard too many times people come forward and say, I really want to do science communication because it's a way of opting in to science, a different way of opting into science. So one of the discussions I'd like to have this morning is ways of raising a little bit of awareness about science communication as a career, either in parallel with a career in science or maybe a complementary one, as a different way of opting in, instead of being seen as a way of opting out. So I would like to just start that conversation. The other thing I tend to respond to when people say, oh yeah, you know, one of the reasons that I find science a difficult career is that it's not very flexible, lots of hard work, incredibly competitive. My response to that, and you think science communication is going to be different? Right, especially when people come and say, well, you know who I want to be like? I want to be like Liz Minchin. I want to have a career. I want to have a career in science journalism. I say, okay, that's interesting. On last count, there were about 5 people in Australia who could manage to do that as a full-time job. And people will disagree with me and say, no, there's only 3. That's not to say that this isn't important work. And I actually am one of the people who believe that this is actually some of the most important work that we need to do. But again, a career in science communication, whether it's going to be in the media, whether it's going to be alongside a research career, whether it's going to be in the institute, whether it's going to be working in terms of public engagement, isn't the easy option. Yes, there may be career flexibility. I call it the flexibility to work 24 hours a day. So I don't think in terms of this notion of science communication being an easier option. The reason I'm feeling passionate about this because I just had these interviews yesterday, and one after the other were saying to me, yeah, I got to get out of science, got to get into science communication. I think, oh boy. Start the heavy lifting now. One person said to me a couple of weeks ago, said, look, I think what you need to do, Joan, is you need to address the problem of the preemptive bubble. Okay? And that's this notion that ahead of people coming into a scientific career, you're sort of standing there looking at this thinking, do I want to do a PhD? Do I want to get on that postdoc round? Is it going to be about endless cycles of funding? Oh, I think not. And it's the preemptive bubble. I also see this happening in relation to science communication, especially right now. And we don't know exactly what the next budget's going to look like as it goes through the legislative process. But as I'm talking to people around the country, I feel like there's a bit of a preemptive buckle happening in science communication. The worry that as science funding is cut or shifted in many ways, a feeling that our work might not be as valued. That may be true. I think we have some hard arguments ahead. But what I don't want to see is a kind of preemptive buckle where people say, look, yes, the scientific funding is really important. I guess communicators do have to lose their jobs. It doesn't need to be an either-or kind of proposition. And I've been really concerned, even on the ASC LinkedIn pages, and please get on there if you're not already, discussions about how we need to protect ourselves. I'm a little bit worried about those discussions. So I guess I wanted to lead our larger discussion today by saying, look, science communication is incredibly important. You know that. It's not about opting in. We need to develop a narrative about opting out. We need to develop a better narrative about how it is opting in. And second, in difficult times, which we might be heading into in terms of this funding environment, it's really important that we can articulate what our value is and not to preemptively buckle in the face of a bit of pressure. So on that note, I'm going to open this up for sort of other perspectives. So first, I have the extreme pleasure of introducing Susan Rowland. Now, I've collaborated with Susan and hope to continue to do so in the future. She does amazing things, including research on how best science students can be taught to communicate more effectively, and indeed at all. And so I think she's going to talk a little about her work in that arena. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Jane. I wasn't going to talk about that at all, actually. But, hey, sorry about that phone call. That's my 10-year-old who's out on the buses and has missed his bus stop. And so I said, darling, I can still text you, but I can't take any more calls. I think he's preemptively buckling. Okay, so we were given a few questions to talk about, or to think about when we came today. And the two that I keyed in on was, what does science communication look like in 2014, and how can we train better science communicators? I'm going to give you a little background. You have to tell me when I'm running over time because I'm a talker. So just shut me up. No. I'm going to give you a little background about the context in which I work. So I'm an academic in the School of Chemistry and Molecular Biosciences. I'm a teaching focused academic, but I'm a biochemist by training. I have an extra qualification in teaching and learning. I'm chair of teaching and learning for that school, and we teach around about 6,000 students a year. So it's a fairly big school, a pretty big teaching load. And we teach chemistry, biochemistry, molecular biology, microbiology, biotechnology, genetics, and bioinformatics. And there is nobody in our school who has any kind of formal training in communication. And we all have a PhD in a wet lab, and a few of us have a teaching qualification as well. Our classes are big, especially the first 2 years. Our first year chemistry, our flagship first year chemistry is 1,600 students. Our first year biology that we're involved in is 1,400. We have our second year classes are routinely between 400 and 700. I look after a class which is 630 students. And so we are not in the business of training science communicators, but we are in the business of training scientists who can communicate. Now, of course, for us as scientists, and you know, even though I'm a teaching-focused academic, I'm very much a scientist, and people within our school would never accept the idea that I was a teaching-focused academic who just did research on communication or teaching and learning, because that would be way too soft and sappy, right? You know, I'm a biochemist, and as soon as I lose that biochemistry flavour, I'm dead. Dead to them as a person. They are wonderful, wonderful people. I love them. But there's a little bit of a lack of understanding of what else students might need, but it's changing, right? So as scientists, we're communicating all the time, of course. We're writing reports and policy documents and grants and papers, and we're doing talks, and this is the normal currency of what we do, and it's all absolutely necessary, and if you can't do it, and if you're not good at it, you will not succeed as a research scientist, because, you know, grants are everything, and that is all about strategy, making an argument, and being able to write beautifully. We know that. A lot of us actually can't write beautifully, and a lot of us have no idea what it means to pick apart a piece of writing and do it well. And I didn't even realise that till I started working with people who were not scientists. And suddenly I realised I have no language around the way I write, and none of us does. This is a bit of a problem. But as teachers, we're becoming more aware that there are other forms of communication that our students need to engage in. About 75% of the communication activity that we do in our curricula is still this kind of standard stuff that a scientist would do. But we're getting more and more stuff that we're introducing now that's not that standard material. And that's driven by two things. The first thing is that in these enormous classes, this enormous first year class of 1,600 chemists, maybe only 8 of those will go on to do honours, and maybe only 5 will go on to do a PhD. In my enormous class of second year biochemists, 630, maybe 12 of those will go on to do honours and 4 will do a PhD. What do the rest of them do? Right? They don't want to be a research scientist, they want to be something else. And so we're starting to realise that we need to serve these students, not just the ones who are going to be the PhD students. So we're starting to realise that these students need soft skills. They need something else other than just learning content. And I think this realisation is a huge thing in modern science teaching. Of course, when I was an undergraduate, we never did any communication. I didn't have to do a talk or any kind of communication other than doing an exam until I got to my honours year. Absolutely terrifying. But now we do all sorts of stuff much earlier. So I just want to tell you a few of the things we do. We get our students to use digital technologies for communication. So we have lots of students who are really tech savvy, and if they're not tech savvy, they can use YouTube to teach them how to be tech savvy. Right? So we rely very heavily on YouTube because we don't know how to use any of the tools. Okay? So, but YouTube does. And so the students do too, they learn it. Right? So consequently we get them to do movies and stop motion animations and blogs and vlogs and podcasts and all that kind of stuff where they're preparing science and teaching it to us essentially. We also get them to do peer interaction and feedback, written peer reviews and talks and documents, peer marking and group activities, a lot of group work, which they hate. Critical analysis and evaluation, journal clubs, analysis of patents, development, pitching, research proposals. Those things are really high-level cognitive stuff. Very difficult for the students. We tend to do those in the higher levels. We also get them to do personal responses, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. I think I'm the only academic in my school who gets my students to do personal responses. They are absolutely terrified of it. They come up and they say to me, I've never written a personal response to anything in my life. What do you want to see? What are the marking criteria? And I say, do a personal response. They say, but what does that mean? I say, give me your opinion. And they go, really? Is that important? Yes, that is important. They are terrified of stepping outside these little boundaries of what is science and what is not. So what are the limitations? There are limitations to getting our students to communicate. The first thing is group participation problems. They're always a problem, but we can get around those with peer reviewing and also with a lot of online monitoring of what our students are doing. We use a lot of online tools now to get them to do collaborative blogs and wikis so we can see who's actually contributing. That takes a lot of the problem out of that. Marking, always a problem. You've got 630 students who've written an essay. Who's going to mark it? Me. Which is 200 to 300 hours per semester. If I choose anything that the students have got to actually do a critical analysis or some kind of creative work, that's a huge, huge marking issue. My way of getting around that, I'll just touch briefly on what I do. Yeah, I've got to shut up now. Right. So my way of getting around that, I'll talk about this later, is that I run an undergraduate research journal, which is voluntary, and I also get my students to help me produce interviews with scientists, which we then podcast to the students and get them to do personal reflections. So the personal reflections are easy to mark, and the things where I'm mentoring communication are voluntary. A couple more tiny things. 2 other biggies. Students' attitude to SOCT activities. They're very wary of them, very uncomfortable. They don't know what the marking criteria are, and they're very resistant to them. And as soon as you put one of them into a course, the evaluation goes down by the students. Right? And the other thing is our ability to direct these activities. We don't have any training in this, generally. We need help. So last year I started a thing called ComSci, which is an annual meeting, I hope, where we get together and people who are experts in communication come and explain to us as scientists how we do better communication activities. I'm asking for your help with this. Right? This is my call to action. I would like science communicators to get involved with us in teaching us how to do communication so that we can help our students do it better. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Soft skills. Okay. Next, I'm very pleased to introduce Suzanne Miller, who's at the Queensland Museum. She also runs a network. It's the Queensland Museum Network. That's it. And so I'm delighted to have her talk to us for 5 minutes as well.
Good morning. It's fantastic to be here, and it's a subject that's really very dear to my heart in particular. Particularly, I'm wanting to come at it from following on, I think, from some of the comments already about education or advocacy. Is science communication education or advocacy? And when I kind of started out in a more kind of public-facing organisation, I'd gone through academic and industrial roles, and suddenly found myself in a museum which had a very public face. It was still very much about education. It was the Committee for the Public Understanding of Science in the UK. It's COFIS. It was all about educating the public, and I think that has completely changed, and it's had to have changed. But I think that's a huge change for the better. We are now about advocacy, and I think following on from some of Joe's comments in particular, the opportunity for us to really influence people. And not just about our own particular area of research, for example, or just about a particular issue, but to create a value proposition around science. And I think that's going to become more and more important. There's a lot of talk at the moment, of course, there's a lot of issues around not having a science ministry in the new federal government, about not having a lot of science funding happening, a lot of cuts happening in science funding. And as a result, our role as science communicators has leapt to the top of the pile, actually, because we have to present a value proposition to the public who vote, who will then influence politicians. And I think I'll come back to that in a little bit, but I'm just going to skip. There's a couple of examples that I wanted to share with you from way back when it kind of occurred to me that it wasn't actually about education. Back in Scotland, it was just, I won't go into the details, but there was a kind of random discussion over a tea break one day about wouldn't it be fantastic to recreate the geological map of Scotland in real rocks. And that developed into a project for schools, actually, the idea that we would create the paper map on the left through working with schools, creating a whole schools programme around understanding geology, but the whole point of it was about getting out of the classroom, getting into the local environment. We paired up schools with their local park rangers and countryside rangers and got kids out collecting rocks. And we thought, our struggle was going to be, actually, I was based at National Museum Scotland, and our struggle was going to be having enough rock to create what we wanted to be a giant map. So this was going to be at least a kind of 5 to 10 metre map. So we weren't talking about something small. And we thought, well, it's all right, because we're in a museum, we've got lots of rocks in the basement, and so we'll be able to fill in the gaps. Well, in actual fact, what was really extraordinary about this was that we had over 600 schools decide to participate. These were all for primary schools, junior schools. That was over 5,800 school students the first year that we ran this project. And our biggest problem was that we got literally over 1,200 kilograms of rock arrived back from the school kids. They'd all gone out, they'd done the sort of lesson plans and working in the class, and then they'd gone out and they'd done expeditions, and they'd gone out with park rangers and they'd knocked bits of rock off with hammers, health and safety aside. That was all fully covered, but it was all about experimentation. It was all about getting out into the countryside, understanding that what you saw on a paper map really related to the physical landscape in some way. What was really interesting about this was that for us it was a fantastic project. It really worked for us. We got masses of fabulous rocks. In fact, we got so many we ended up doing more than one map, and we created lots of subsets which were then sent out back to the schools, sort of smaller versions of the local map. But this map became a bit of a cause célèbre because the parents of the kids got so excited about getting out of the classroom But the parents started writing to their local MPs and saying this was a really great idea. We didn't ask them to do that. And before we knew it, we were asked if the map, once it was created, and it turned out to be quite a big job creating the map, but once it was created, could go in on permanent display in the Scottish Parliament. And for the first time, we were being asked to turn up at tea time in Parliament and explain when the MPs came out of speaker time and so on. They would stand and chat to us with a mug of tea in their hands and talk to us about geology and about science and about why it was important and why kids had just got so involved in this. The other project that happened, which was also extraordinarily unexpected, was we were then at some point a few years later developing the Royal Museum project for Edinburgh. And in order to do that, we had to move out all the old exhibitions. And one of the things we had to do was move out the large stuffed animals. And those had been there for over 70 years, those animals. And although it was a moderately popular gallery, it was pretty old, it was pretty dusty. And of course, what do you do? Well, you have to wrap up the specimens. We wrapped up our elephants in bubble wrap, because that's what you do in museums. And one day I got a phone call from the front information desk saying that this little boy has arrived. And there's a girl in the photo, but I'll come back to that. This little boy's arrived. He's come all the way from the West Coast to see the elephants. He's obsessed about elephants, and of course the gallery was at that point closed off because we were packing it up. So I went down and we spoke to the contractors. We got hard hats and the high-vis jackets, and we went through. This little boy was 4. This is his sister. And he had a stuffed elephant under one hand, and he had a book about elephants under the other arm. And we went through with his parents and his sister. And we walked through and said, "Now, don't get frightened, because we've wrapped them up to protect them, but you'll still be able to see the shape of the trunk, and And we walked in, and he completely lost it. I mean, he was just hysterical, this little boy. I thought, oh my God, what have I done? And it turned out, actually, once he'd calmed down a bit, and he was just completely overwhelmed, because he'd seen every David Attenborough film about elephants. He'd seen every documentary. He loved Bar the elephant. He loved Dumbo. He loved his elephant toy, which went everywhere with him. But he thought elephants were this size, because that was all he'd ever. He'd seen them on the telly, and he'd seen them in books. It never occurred to him the scale of an elephant. So, of course, he was confronted with his elephant. Not only that, it was in bubble wrap. Well, what then became really interesting was that there was a journalist who was doing from the Scotsman, the local newspaper, who was doing a behind-the-scenes tour about the project, and he kind of picked up on this, and it became a bit of a public campaign around how much bubble wrap does it take to wrap an elephant, and so it became a bit of a national competition, and people really got behind it. And the result of that was that politicians started to get behind it. And there were questions in Parliament about how much bubble wrap does it take to wrap an elephant. The answer actually is about 22 square metres. But what was really interesting about it was that it piqued political interest. So we went from having a story about how much bubble wrap does it take to wrap an elephant to, well, isn't that really interesting? And how do you know what the surface area of an elephant is? And the fact is, there is actually a paper. There is a scientific paper with a formula in it to work out the surface area of an elephant. And it's to do with, and it's incredibly precise, actually. Something like 8.238 minus 7.064 times the height of the elephant from the foot to the shoulder, plus I think it is there's a number times the circumference of the front foot of the elephant. Seriously, there you go. Like, you find it, and it is a verifiable scientific paper, peer reviewed. But what was really interesting was that it started conversations about the ecology of elephants. It started the conversations then about, well, were mammoths elephants? The whole thing sort of burgeoned into quite a significant scientific debate in the popular media and in Parliament. And we had politicians coming because they wanted to see the bubble-wrapped elephants. We actually started running tours for people just to see the elephants. Because, of course, we had one that was a taxidermied elephant, had the trunk and everything, and then we had the skeleton, which, of course, doesn't have a trunk, and so that sparked another debate about the fact that trunks don't have bones in them. So it was really interesting for me, because I hadn't realised until really those two projects how powerful a science story could become in terms of advocacy, and particularly political advocacy. And I know that shortly there'll be a new science and research strategy for Australia being announced. And Ian Chubb, who is a very big supporter, actually, the chief scientist of communication and science, and he does it very well himself, one of his pillars, everybody has pillars and strategies these days, but one of his pillars will be about public engagement. Because he understands that, particularly in financially difficult times, the thing that will matter are the voters feeling value for science and for research and for engagement in that, because they will then influence the politicians. Scientists as a cohort are a relatively small number of people. The voting public are who the politicians listen to. And so we need to be out there, I think, more than ever, actually, to become much more relevant. We have a much, much clearer position, and I think a much, much clearer purpose than we've had in a really long time, which is about advocating for science through science communication. And that for us is really going to be, I think, absolutely critical. And so there's going to be, I think, a much higher regard, which hopefully will also then influence that positive, proactive, this is what I want to do, not this is what I'm going to do because I don't want to do this. But I think that's really fundamentally important for us. So we've got a moment of opportunity here. We should really grasp it, really encourage people. And just very briefly on the point of communication. I mean, I'm certainly really heartened. When I was doing my PhD, in fact, the first time I ever spoke kind of publicly about research was when I was doing my honours presentation, and it terrified the living daylights out of me. At the weekend, my 6-year-old daughter was doing a prezi. I don't even know how to do a prezi. She did a prezi because she's doing this morning to her class a prezi on space, on the solar system. So our kids are learning how to communicate from a really young age. She was doing show and share at school at kindy. So those soft skills, I think, are going to be coming through. There's a bit of a lag, and obviously we've got a huge amount to do in that hiatus period. But it's a moment of opportunity for us, and we've just got to grasp it with both hands and run with it.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, now I'm going to introduce Tamara Davis, who is a senior, no, you were associate professor in astrophysics. And
talking about crazies about astrophysics. Hi everybody, so I'm a physicist, and what I thought I would talk to you guys about today is a bit of a personal story about how I came up and became a bit of a science communicator from extremely shaky beginnings. I mean, like most physicists, I didn't get into physics because I enjoyed speaking in public. In fact, yes, I was absolutely terrified. When I had to stand up in front of a class at school, I just completely froze. The first time I gave a conference presentation, sitting in the audience before I got up, my teeth were chattering so much, I honestly thought I was going to break a tooth. And yet now I've ended up being in a position where you just have to, and if you can, it's really important to speak to not only people at university and stuff, but the general public. I think it's a really important thing, like everybody has been saying so far, especially in the political environment, and getting people who aren't necessarily preaching to the converted, not people who come to science talks, but getting the message out to people who might not respect science. And I think that's one of the important things that we can do. So I actually did a science arts degree. I did physics and philosophy. And during that whole time, I did one course that scared the living bejesus out of me. Now, I wanted to get you guys to guess which of these courses it might be. So, let me say, you can see them up there. Let's see a show of hands. Who thinks radiation biophysics would have been the most terrifying course? No? General relativity? Ethics? No, not logic? Ah, yes, philosophy is far scarier than science. See that? Yeah. So, radiation biophysics, yeah, that was actually enormously comforting. It taught us how to cure cancer and the fact that radiation is all around us, so we didn't need to be as stressed out about it as the media makes us think. General relativity and ethics both taught me the same thing, which is actually that there is not necessarily a right answer. Everything is relative, it depends on your perspective. And logic is the thing that's absolutely terrified me. And the reason for this is that that was one of my arts subjects, and so I was in an arts class, and as I was one of the few scientists there, and I was like, what on earth are they going to teach us? It's logic, right? There is nothing to be learned. Everybody is going to get 100% because how can you not think logically? And yet in class, I was sitting beside people who were going, like, this is so stressful. Have you got a tutor? I just can't figure out how to do this. And it was an absolute revelation to me that people didn't understand logic. And these were university educated people as well. And as a physicist, you were just, it was astonishing to me. And it was the dawning of my realization that logical arguments just don't work for people. So when we start communicating science, the mistake that a lot of scientists make is to put forward a well-reasoned, absolutely rock-solid logical argument that is absolutely unconvincing to the people who are not engaged in this. And I remember a quote when I was thinking about this. This is actually from a priest. It says, "They may forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel." And there's another quote actually as well from Maestro, from Peter Goldsworthy. It was, "If you want someone to believe your lies, set them to music." And I think that's a really interesting concept, because it really is, if you can attach a fact to an emotion, it has a very powerful message. And I think a lot of the people who are sort of our opposition in science communication, like I'm thinking of people who, like climate change deniers, the anti-vaccine lobby and these kind of things, they play on people's fears and they talk about, they give people sort of things that they want to hear, reassurance, and that can be a really powerful message. And that's a lot of the things that we as scientists, coming from a logical perspective, don't do so well. Now, the other thing that we've had to learn recently as scientists is that our ivory tower has fallen. There is no more standing up. The respect for scientists seems to have been eroded. We can't stand up and say, "Oh, this is what I found," and have people believe us. And those towers really are tall these days, not in the sense that we should be separated, but the amount of knowledge that you've gained by the time you've done a PhD, so that you've got a really narrow but very, very deep understanding of your subject matter, and it can be really difficult to convey why you believe that, why we understand what we know. And that can be very difficult to explain to people who don't have those layers of knowledge, who didn't do 10 years of university to get that astrophysics PhD. But that's what we have to do, get it back down to a human level. Because if we don't do that, then we're behaving like a priesthood. We're asking people to take us on faith just because we're trustworthy, not because we can explain to them what's going on. So teaching people the scientific method, and from school kids onwards, and why there's uncertainty and doubt, and sometimes, and why we can't be absolutely precise, but why the overall picture you should have confidence in, is one of our things that we should strive for, I think. And just to wrap up, I went to Woodford, I think last weekend or the weekend before, where they had their planting festival. And I went because one of my friends was giving a couple of talks on astrophysics there. And he gave one that was about his research, and it was very engaging and interactive and got the audience involved. But then he gave another one that was about Aboriginal astronomy, and comparing it to sort of the myths of the Greeks and our modern understanding of what the stars are. And it was full of stories. And I think the Aboriginal elders, in their the way they passed on knowledge through narrative and stories, is a really powerful thing that we can do, and it's something that we can learn as science communicators. So yeah, I think if my aim now is, if I can do anything, I want to try and put the soul back into science and communicate it that way. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, excellent. Now, last but certainly not least is Liz Minton, who is Queensland editor of The Conversation. So now you can tell us all about how these stories get told.
I actually asked to go last deliberately. I always was, if where possible, went third in debating at school, because I like taking notes and I like responding to what some of the others have said. So can I close this? Will that shut it down? Oh, I'm just trying to get it out of the way. So I just wanted to pick up on a few points that each of the speakers made. I agree, I am seeing Joan made the point about a preemptive buckle. I'm seeing that all over the country, and people going, oh, well, I guess we're going to get cut. And it is a tough time, particularly for science communicators, but equally I'd point to my own industry of the media, where I used to work at The Age, big staff cuts, manufacturing industry, big staff cuts, pretty much pick an industry, and there are people who are facing big challenges. So I really agree with the panel in saying, you know, it's very easy to get into the mindset of it's really tough, but it's tough for a lot of people, so you've got to make the case for yourself. And I think I really like Suzanne Miller's. I don't think I can even make the case for science better than Suzanne Miller did, in talking about her example of bubble-wrapped elephants and stuff. It was brilliant. And I agree that there is reason for doom and gloom in some ways, but all I have to point to is I fucking love science. Now, does everyone here know I fucking love science? Anyone not know? It's a website, well, it's a Facebook page, and it's got its own site now too. It's got more than 12 million likes globally, and it pops up in my Facebook feed, and it pops up in a lot of people's feeds. And it's just cool science explained well. Often it's just a picture or a video. And so there are, whether it's the conversation or I fucking love science, and I always have to be careful where I mention that. The venue is not always appropriate. But there are more avenues than there have ever been. While, yes, there may be cuts to specialist science reporting in lots of mainstream news media, but people are still finding their science news. They still want those stories. So again, I would totally back up everything Suzanne said in terms of get out there and make the case and be creative in how you do it, because people do respond if you're smart about it. Tamara made the point about confidence, actually, and that you started with the sort of getting up here and when you first started to give talks, that fear. And I think that actually holds a lot of women back, not just in science, but in a lot of industries. If you haven't read it already, I would recommend reading Lean In by the Facebook Chief Operating Officer, Sheryl Sandberg. You can also watch her TEDx talk. Some people have criticised it as, well, you know, she's a hugely paid white woman, upper middle class. You know, she's talking about her experience in business. But I think there are a lot of lessons, including for women in science, men in science too, but for women in science, particularly of not putting your hand up for the job until you're sure you can take it. You know, if you're pregnant or thinking about starting a family, leaning back and going, well, I guess I'm not going to, there's no point going for a job as the manager of my team because in a year from now I probably will be at home. She actually argues that's exactly the time to lean in, because once you take maternity leave, I can see there's someone whispering about it. Once you take maternity leave, when you come back, you can often face challenges in then stepping up. So the more you can lean in before you, and including when you're thinking about starting a family, the more you're setting yourself up for down the track. And I can keep talking about all of their talks actually, but I'd also say in terms of, Joan mentioned at the beginning about how to get more women in science. We actually at The Conversation have quite a good columnist. She's a senior researcher at the University of Melbourne. She writes a column, Science versus Babies. And she's that, you know, I've got my KPIs to meet because I need to get X number of stories in the media. I've got this industry partnership to promote. I need to find a way to push that out. You can get so focused on what you need to do and what you need to achieve that you're not thinking about the audience. And I can tell that instantly when I see a pitch. If it says, you know, we have an industry partnership, it's really worthwhile and we think you should run a story on that. Well, no. What's the story? Why should Mrs. Kafoops care? And for the conversation now, someone was asking before about who our audience is. It's incredibly broad and it's growing all the time. We have 1.6 million unique readers come to The Conversations Australian and UK site every month. And our eventual reach is more than 5 million articles read globally because we publish under Creative Commons. And the key thing that we're doing, and I guess the person I think about when I'm applying my Mrs. Kafoops test, is we're applying a 16-year-old level of literacy to our editing. And so it's does this make sense to a 16-year-old? And that sometimes, particularly when I'm talking to, you know, really smart experts or academics, sometimes there can be a little titter that goes around the room. 16, that's a bit simplistic. First of all, I'd say if you're talking to newspapers, you need to be aiming for 12-year-olds. But also I would say if you care about people actually understanding it, it's not just about reaching young people, it's also about people whose first language might not be English. Australia is an incredibly multicultural country. If you're not bothering to make your information accessible, you are shutting them out of the conversation quite deliberately. Also, The Conversation has managed to get a lot of global republications in incredibly diverse countries, India, Indonesia,
you know, across Europe. In fact, when we post our morning newsletter, we can see where in the world it's being opened, the email is being opened, and literally every continent there are people reading the conversation. So if you want to get your stuff out, you want to make it understood, I would be very much advising that you're applying the same sorts of rules that we're applying about making it readable and making it accessible, because to me, this is all taxpayer-funded knowledge. And as Suzanne was saying, if you want people to stand up for your area, if you want voters to go out and be telling politicians that you shouldn't be cutting this, or you should have a minister for science, or whatever it is that you want to see happen, you have to make the case for it. And because I did want to kind of go under my time, the so what thing, that to me again is super obvious, but you might think that biodiversity is the most important issue that we face, or climate change is the most important issue that we face. Biodiversity is a good example because it's not even a word that most people use. So you can get so close to your area and think, well, this is just obviously important. My first question when I talk to people, and biodiversity is a good example, so what? Well, okay, we won't have as many species, does that matter? Now that might seem like a really stupid question, but if you're not asking that question before you're trying to tell your story to other people, I'm going to be asking that question as an editor, but also your readers will. And the easiest thing for a reader or a listener or a viewer to do is change the channel to turn off. So you're asking for their time, and time is the most precious thing that any of us have. We're all only here for a limited amount of time. So respect their time, and if you do that, and if you're thinking about, okay, who am I trying to talk to? And sometimes it might be, even to say the conversation, as much as we have a broad audience. I'll give one example. We had a really nice piece from a group of nutritionists at QT, and they had this new program on obesity. And so when we sort of talked it through, we sort of figured, well, the ideal audience for this would be parents, because they can potentially participate in this. So they weren't trying to talk to other experts. They were trying to actually reach Queensland parents and Australian parents generally and give them some lessons on Australian kids getting fat and getting fatter by the year. And so rather than starting with obesity is a terribly serious topic and we really should care about that, which again is kind of, okay, I'm going to get lectured. The nutritionist started, we talked it through, and the nutritionist started with the fact that as a nutritionist, the most common emotion that she sees among parents is guilt. They walk into her office and they just feel like the worst parents in the world because their kid has got fat and they don't know what to do about it. Now straight away you're talking to parents and they can relate to that. And by talking that through, again, we're not just thinking at the conversation about how to get people published with us, we're also thinking, now who else might like this? Once we'd agreed that would be the tack we take, I said, I can be pretty sure that someone like Mamamia will republish this, and they did, and it was their lead parenting article feature for the week. So again, it's the, who are you trying to talk to, who do you want to reach? You're not trying to persuade your colleagues, you're not trying to impress your boss. Ultimately, if you want to communicate well, you need to be thinking about your audience, and you need to be asking so what. And I could keep talking, but I'm going to shut up. Thanks.
Excellent. I think we've got a few minutes, so let's open it up to some questions for you. For any of the panel, I've got lots of questions, but I will let you guys go first. Okay. And then, hi, go ahead, go for it.
So I've got a question about the whole panel, perhaps specifically to Suzanne. You had some really wonderful stories about achieving science advocacy very successfully. Stories are both incidental, good luck. How do you engineer that kind of fantastic engagement from politicians, particularly in an environment at the moment where everybody's desperate to get that engagement and try and demonstrate that we're doing something interesting with the science that our taxpayers' dollars are paying for?
It's a really good question. Yeah, those were two just serendipitous opportunities, and it was really just that it didn't talk in comparison to what could happen. And so, as a result, I make sure our organisation, every single week, we have at least one good news story that goes out, and the minister can announce. There's nice on ministers, they love announcing. They love being able to announce good news stuff. They don't like announcing cuts, they don't like announcing sort of government policy because that's boring. It's just money. But if you can give them a good news story that they can talk to and allow them to take the glory, that's the trick. So it's really about visibility. And so we have a really clear strategy about getting at least one science good news story out every single week, and we make sure that goes across the minister's desk. And sometimes other ministers pick it up. And now what we're seeing is that ministers here in Queensland are starting to buy for getting to do the announcements. So on Friday we've got something happening at East in Queensland, and we've got 2 ministers turning up. And I was like, how the hell did you coordinate 2 ministers' diaries? You give them something they both want to talk about. They both want to be there, and then of course you've got the challenge of who was first to move on and shit. We'll leave that up to their offices to deal with. But it's about just really having a really clear strategy, so that you don't just rely on serendipitous, crops up and it's great, and you're really lucky. You have to have a really clear strategy, but essentially in some ways it's about political inputs. Politicians probably are very, they have large egos, and that's why they're politicians. They're out there in the public space, and they want to be talking about good things. So it's about giving good news stories, or about giving them the information. And in New Zealand, we're generally more about controversial, so it's a bit easier for us in many ways because we're not doing particularly controversial stuff. Or at least we don't think we're controversial. We might do controversial stuff, but that's not the story.
It's great. That really resonates. I have a story recently out, and I made sure that the company could mention self-funding the research. And I got a letter from them from LinkedIn saying, so they give you the response.
Frame that one. Other questions? Yes. Bruce.
I'm really interested in this conversation around advocacy. I just would like the panel's opinion of, if as science communicators our role becomes selling science, is there a role for us also in empowering the public, whoever they might be, into actually thinking more deeply about science and maybe disagreeing with it or disagreeing with the direction that science is going in? I'd be interested in hearing the panel's views on that.
Look, I think one of the things that is actually really hard for us as communicators, and also hard when we don't have a science background in particular, is understanding that science doesn't actually always have right or wrong answers. There's no definitive. And I think one of the biggest issues that we have in communicating science is probability. And so we have to be much more comfortable about understanding and be really open about the fact that it's debate, and that it's not a hard and fast fact. But then I think what we need to be doing is talking about the value of what's the impact, it's about the stories that you can tell, and the way that you can weave that story. And the climate change stuff has been really interesting, because I think one of the other challenges that we do have is that I've worked with BBC. My husband was a BBC science producer for many years. Which infuriated me as a lot of chemists. It used to infuriate me because they say, well, of course you have to have balanced opinions. So yeah, you've got 99.9% of the scientific community in this discipline thinks this, and you've got 0.0001% thinks this. That's actually not quite balanced. Sometimes maybe it doesn't create the sort of weighting. And I think that's what we've got to be better at doing, is talking about all that, not being uncomfortable about doing that, but then talking about the weight of the scientific evidence. So it's about evidence-based science. But it is a real challenge. We've got to bring everybody along on the journey. But I think actually probability is one of the biggest issues. I did stats in university, I still get confused about probability.
I was going to add that certainly one of the learning objectives that we have for our students is that they're able to deal with uncertainty. And that is something that their ability and the idea of grey is something that we see our students as being profoundly uncomfortable with. And these are students who are being trained to deal with this kind of material and trained to make better judgments and weigh up evidence and consider probability. Just the word probability for them is like maths! I don't quite know how you get it at getting people to deal with that grey, but what you very often see is that people are happy to come down on one side or the other, and they don't want to think about that sort of bulk of unknown stuff in between. They would have to actually evaluate to get somewhere in the middle of that. So it's easier to just make a yes or no decision. Yes, I agree with that change, or I'm going to change. And it's a profound part of human nature, I think, to have that wanting clarity. And so the question is really important. Yes, I think it's really important, but I think it also drives me against it as part of inherently human to want clarity or a decision.
Yeah, I think having people think critically about what they're reading is really, really important. So we want them to think critically about the 0.01% that's dissenting and it being portrayed as 50% argument. But in order for them to be able to do that, we have to also furnish them with the explanations of why the science is coming out with the solutions that it is, and bring that information. Not just say this is how it is, but try and explain how it got to that answer.
I'd like to say that I actually have buzzwords that I hate. Empower is one of them, and I also would say that's not to try not to. But that's not about you. It's more just there's a lot of jargon in communication, and science communication is like any of it. But one of the best pieces we run on this is what science communicators can learn from listening to people. And so before you go out and trying to persuade anyone of anything, I'd be saying shut up and listen. And in fact, that piece by Will Grant and someone at AMU was a really nice example of they did research in it. So if you want to be persuading people to whatever you're working on, so let's take, for instance, working with farmers who traditionally have been more sceptical about climate change because they know from lived experience the climate is incredibly variable and can really hurt them in some years more than in other years. And also they tend to be a bit more conservative politically, and there's lots of research around if you're more conservative, you're more likely to think it's not a problem. If you're left-wing, you're more likely to think it is a problem. That's actually one of the biggest problems we have as a society is that we have these issues like climate change where it becomes I'm of this political persuasion, therefore I will think this, which does my head in a bit because, but part of that is reinforced by poor communication where people who, for instance, do think climate change is a problem don't listen to the language and listen to the way that people think and what they're saying and don't try to respond in ways that work effectively to persuade people. John Cook is here in the room, if any of you don't know his work, it's really, really good. So he's got the skeptical science, which is all about answering those commonly asked questions, doing it in plain English, giving a variety of different answers. So that's really great stuff. But so the first thing I would say, whether you're trying to persuade politicians or ordinary people, whoever it might be, is to listen to where they're coming from, and to then use the kind of language and and relate your stories to something that they can relate to as well.
I have one question. It's going to sound slightly practical. It's about the how-to of communication. So, I was very impressed by Tamara's Prezi. I love how those things whip in and whip out of there. And everything's supposed to be on Facebook, and Facebook's a bit old news. Actually, we're supposed to be on 6 or 7 things. Got my better thing going on. But we did some research in relation to the Inspire in Australia scheme and found that if you look at science communication activities practiced by people who identify as science communicators in institutions where that's clearly marked, only about 5% of people are using what we would call social media, digital media, the things that you were trying to engage students with, to do what we call science engagement. The rest of this stuff is sort of, fact sheets up on Facebook, but a fact sheet up on Facebook is still a fact sheet. It's a kind of one-dimensional kind of broadcast sort of model of communication. So I guess I'm kind of interested in this because there's a lot of rhetoric about how, we live in this great new communication world where we have all of these fabulous tools, but our research suggests that we're not using them. So I'm very interested in your response to this conundrum, paradox.
That's all. It seems incredibly simple, but they had to make all the judgment calls behind all of even the colour choices. And then when you clicked on it, it came up with a short summary of the key things in that area. So deceptively simple, but incredibly popular, and much more popular than the other media's version of it. Our own interactive, but it was our own graphic of the conversations graphic about similar wins and losses. That was the most popular with our budget coverage as well. So people are looking for something that's easy to relate to, but they do like it when they can track a little bit more with it. But I would also say that some of the things that we're playing with more, for instance, comments on the internet can get talked down as just a place where people shout at each other, and sometimes that's true, quite often that's true. But comments can also be really useful, and an example I'd give would be we commissioned an article from the head of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, who's linked to James Cook Uni and I think UQ as well, but so Paul White from Florence. And the starting point for that article was not, you're going to write a piece explaining your decision about, very controversial decision about acid point and dredging and disposal of material in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. The starting point was not, you're going to write an article and then broadcast it to people and that's it. The whole idea was, can you write an article defending what you've done and giving your explanation for what you've done, but then explicitly say if your questions haven't been answered in this article, we're going to be watching the comments, leave your question in the comments and we will respond to them. So you will often see those live back and forth things. This was not quite live in the sense of people writing something and then seeing the live text pop up or anything. It was a slower process, but it meant that over a couple of days, we had agreed on one full day that they ended up doing over 2 or 3. They knew that they had a problem in terms of people questioning their decision, and the point was not to give them a free kick in terms of, letting them sort of just say their version of events. But for our audience, we knew that a lot of our readers had a lot of questions. We wanted to give them a chance to ask those questions, and rather than shouting into the ether about this is terrible, why are we doing this? We'll ask the authority why we're doing this. And people loved that, and we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comments, more than usual, and people really appreciated it. And even the ones that still disagreed with what the authority had done, at least got a chance to have their say. So that's the kind of thing where if you can figure out ways to let your experts interact with people or essentially give people the sense that they're being heard, again, it's the listening part of it is incredibly important.
I was just checking our Twitter feed.
Yes.
The Centre of Excellence for also astrophysics. We've got Twitter and are trying to engage people like that. And a couple of people are really active, and it's become really instinctive now. Just at a conference, to something exciting pops up, and you check this out, and you tweet it. And one of our members has 10,000 followers. And it's getting up there, and so it's not small, but it's something that's becoming more popular. It's sort of fun.
Just on a smaller scale, I've got a Facebook page and I specifically don't have my work colleagues rendered on that Facebook page so I can say what I'm saying, not having to crunch with work the next day. And I also follow feeds up to my science alert, real vaccines, and genomics and stuff. Whenever something interesting comes up, I repost it. And most of that my network of people who are scientists, friends and family. And it goes and spreads throughout the community, and it's a little thing you can do, but it's actually very important, and it's another way of getting information and science out there and just sort of pushing out the blanket, because it goes out to some of my friends who are conservatives who also have, I love candidate table and these and stuff like that. Various things, and it's just a really important thing to do on a small scale that everyone can do.
Hi, I work at UQ, but I wear another hat. I'm the chair of life sciences for women in technology, and I would like to ask our speakers if they would have a take-home message I could forward to our members, because I would like to encourage them to communicate about what they do and the great thing that women in technology and science are doing in Queensland. And I really struggle to actually get them participating and to sort of, get the message out there. Like you, I've got Facebook pages, I've got Twitter feeds, I love fucking love science and all that. And every day I see the stories that I love and that I share them. So, that's so cool, that's something I really want to talk about and that I want to share. But how can I insufflate that to the people I'm working with and just encourage them to do the same thing? Their take-home message I could give them.
I used to think that if I just sat back and did the work, that somebody would notice. And actually, no one does. You've got to tell people. You've got to tell people all the time. And particularly, this is going to sound really sexist about this, particularly so with women advocate less for one another than men do in terms of public meetings. Men are very, very, I'm not just saying this from my personal experience, I did a women leadership course a couple of years ago that was run by UQ, and it was talking about female advocacy versus male advocacy, and women who advocate for themselves are seen as pushy, whereas men who advocate for themselves are seen as forceful and confident, and women who advocate for others are
seen as behaving appropriately, while men who advocate for others are seen as soft. That's the sociology institute. But I just think that's rubbish. You know? I think you can advocate for yourself without looking arrogant. You can advocate for yourself if it's the truth, and in particular if you're also talking about how your work is helping others and involving other people, then you are self-advocating as well as advocating for others at the same time. And I think that's a nice way for women to do it without hiding behind, oh, I didn't actually do this, that's everybody else. You have to sell yourself, because the men are out there doing it, so we should have to do it as well.
Okay, Tamara,
I actually had a question, because for the audience, for everybody, within the researchers, people doing research in science, it's not always seen as a very positive thing to go out and do science communication. And I was wondering how we can change that. So I'm moving from my fellowship finishes this year for research, and I'm on to teaching half-time next year. And we were talking about, I was discussing with my supervisors what kinds of things I was going to have to drop to cut to be able to take on that extra teaching load. And number one on the list was my science communication outside of the teaching. So events like this, I was may not be appropriate if I had to cut things. But I think these things are really important, and I really like doing science communication. So that was just a personal story from them. That perception is out there. It's sort of not your core business. Not something that you should focus on.
Yeah, that's true. It's not seen as part of it's not something you can put on your CV as something you can be promoted for.
Except in business. Yes. That's right. So, I think it's one of the other messages is I think we actually, and this might be sound a bit top, but there's almost a moral imperative. When I talk to people who are successful in science and successful careers in science, and this goes for women and men, but they usually chose to do science because they had a really strong role model, very often a teacher or a friend or a parent. And I remember really clearly, the reason why I chose to go on and do science is because I had a fantastic chemistry teacher, Mrs. Patterson, and that was in primary 4, and we did experiments with test tubes of water and turning upside down a piece of cardboard on the bottom. We all got completely soaked, but I remember it so clearly, and I actually think we have a real imperative to continue to act as role models, because we're really privileged to have the roles we have, but we've usually been influenced by somebody themselves who is really inspirational. So, I think we've got to carry on that tradition, and it's a really powerful thing to be able to do.
Can I ask you a question? What's the, for your colleagues in life sciences, if they had to, say, in terms of what they're focusing on, are they driven by citations, or are they driven by, academically, what's the thing that they're told is the most important thing? Publications and grants. Okay. So publications,
definitely.
If publications and grants matter, then pre-communication matters a lot for that. So publish or perish is a very common mantra, but the Conversation published a really nice article by a group of Queensland researchers actually, looking at how early career publication is a very good predictor for long-term career success in academia. And so it was by Bill Lawrence, but just look up Conversation publish or perish. And what it found was if you're not getting out there quite early on in your career, actively trying to publish in journals, but also places like Conversation, reaching a bigger audience, but sort of promoting yourself can be very accurately predicted that you're not going to be doing as well. Women are not doing as well on that. And often even the career interruption quite often the family can be away. But basically, if you're not getting out there early, promoting yourself, publish or perish, but also promote or perish to get yourself out there, you'll earn less money. I mean, that's a simple message. And you won't be senior. You'll be sitting there going, I know more than that person that just got promoted over me, but the rest of the world seems to not know that. Well, maybe you haven't told the rest of the world all you know. So, and a good example even in a conversation with our profiles. Anytime you're doing a profile for yourself or a CV for yourself, don't be modest. So it's, have you won awards? Did you, have you been nominated by your peers as a future leader, any of those things? So absolutely promote or perish, and I would recommend recommend reading that article and show them. And sorry, and one other thing, in terms of both citations and grants, clear communication also matters. So there's a growing body of research looking in the area of metrics, which is looking at how, let's say you publish an article in a journal, that's great. Well, who's going to read it? People who subscribe to that journal and other people searching that journal. That's a pretty small pool of people. There's a growing body of research to show that if you tweet or using social media, you get out a plain English version of that, or when something that kind of says quite in a short, sharp way what it is that you've found. The citations for that far higher. The conversation. One of our authors, and also Wendy Miller, she is an academic at QUT. She published her first article for us in a heat wave over summer down in southeastern Australia. She was smart. She promoted herself with her profile with us. She put in all her publications, so she put in a full profile of herself. She put in publications, and because she did all of that, when she got published with us and that article did well, she got a lot of media follow-up, but her downloads and citations will have to wait for longer. Downloads of her publications took off, and I've got this in a presentation I'll be giving at QUT in about now. But they were ticking along at about, the best she'd ever got was 100 in a month. In the months she published with us, it took off, and they've been around 400 ever since, so in the last 2 months. So purely on citations and on grants, if you can't communicate well and if you're not promoting, Mrs. Kafook says so what? Again with grants, why should you be funded for this? Mrs. Kafook says so what? Talking to your audience, why does this matter? Do that well, and yeah, you'll have a much better chance.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to thank the audience for a great session this morning, and also thank the panelists. Thank you very, very much. Mrs. Kafook says, so what, is now in my brain for the rest of the so what? I can hear her. And I'm going to hand over to Pahia Cooper, who is also going to close the session. But thank you very much. I enjoyed this a lot.